Now to discuss this with us further is journalist Neil Clark. Now, Neil, thank you for joining us today. Talks will include discussing ways to cooperate better with member states as well as improving information exchanges with the Arab world. What changes should we expect to see?
Well, I think there's a big difference between the exchanges that we probably expect to see and the exchanges that we really should be seeing. Because I think at the moment there's a big sort of PR exercise going on from the European leaders and the political elites in the West. And yet the double standards here are really glaring. We just heard on your clip there Philip Hammond talking about the great danger that extreme Islamism and radical groups pose to us all. And yet this has been the same Philip Hammond, the British Defence Minister. The British government has been siding with radical jihadists in countries like Syria, for example, to topple the government there. We know what happened in Libya, which has become a magnet for jihadists because of the Western policy towards that country and the war against Libya in 2011. So I think there seems to be a big reluctance to look at the root causes and to look at the main thing that needs to change is the Western foreign policy. We've had a series of aggressive wars launched against Muslim countries. We've been inflaming tensions. And unless there's a radical change in this, then I think all this other talk is just sort of hot air, to be honest.
Now, we know that the plan is for EU leaders to also devise a strategy to deal with EU citizens heading to fight in war zones and returning radicalised. So how is this possible in respect to the core values of the EU that Mogherini has mentioned?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the contradictions are all over the place, aren't they? Because for the last few years, it seems to be that the governments of the West, particularly of Britain, have been siding with these, on the same side as these radical jihadists in countries like Syria. And now, of course, the policy seems to have shifted a lot. It's to make sure people don't try and go over there and they can be arrested when they come back. They may be stopped from travelling. And so it's all over the place, the contradictions. And we're in the worst of all possible worlds, really. We've had really the Western powers have contributed a large deal to this terrible situation. And they're now using, the so-called terror threat to Europe, which we must get in perspective. It's very important that 17 people were killed in France 2 weeks ago. That was awful. But 2,000 people is reported killed in Nigeria by Boko Haram. And in fact, the terror threat in Africa, as I've just written in a new article of mine, is far greater than the terror threat to Europe. And yet our politicians in the West are keen to hype it up, I think, in order to, I'm afraid, increase surveillance, to restrict our civil liberties even further. And so I think we're in a very, very dangerous period. And it's a kind of vicious circle of all the wrong policies, creating the wrong results, and then more wrong policies.
The aim is also to have a united response with Europe working as one, but without new legislation. How realistic is this?
I don't think it is very realistic. I think there are divisions in Europe. These sort of meetings, European leaders try to speak with one voice, but I know that there's been a lot of disagreements in Europe. Take the issue of Syria. I can think back to just under 2 years ago when it was Britain and France were kind of bullying the other European Union members to kind of lift the arms embargo on the Syrian rebels, to get arms out to the so-called Syrian rebels. And I know a lot of other European countries were very concerned about that, saying the rebels, that the jihadists would get the arms. And of course, the rise of the Islamic State is all to do with this policy of arming so-called rebels in Syria. So there are divisions in Europe, and they're now coming, having to, for PR purposes, to come together. But there is a real, I would say, divide in Europe between, if you like, the more hawkish neoconservative countries. Britain, I'm afraid, is leading that group. And these policies that Britain has been doing have been disastrous for the rest of Europe. And I hope that countries in Europe who want to see a different path speak up a bit more, and we don't just get the British line being accepted all the time.
Journalist Neil Clark, thank you very much for joining us today.